Hilda, Chapter 1. Mein erster Kampf. The crackling voice from the radio broke through my dreams before I could stop it. I groaned and turned over, pulling the blanket tighter around me, hoping to muffle the sound, but it was no use. The words attack and invasion drifted through the thin walls, mixing with the clinking sound of dishes in the kitchen. My brothers were already up. I could hear their voices, low, tense, not like the usual morning banter. They were talking about the news again. I blinked against the early light filtering through the small window, rubbing my eyes as sleep slipped away. I didn't want to know what the radio was saying, not today. I had heard enough in the past few weeks. Rumors of war, whispered fears, and that awful feeling of something big and terrible creeping closer. War always felt like something far off, happening to other people in other places, but this time it seemed to be pressing in our doorstep. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet meeting the cold floorboards. The room still held its chill from last night. I reached for my sweater, pulling it over my thin nightdress, and stood, my body still sluggish with sleep. The smell of coffee, sharp and bitter, mingled with the faint scent of burnt bread drifting from the kitchen. I walked slowly toward the door, hesitating for a moment as the radio grew louder. The German army has crossed the Polish border at dawn today. I paused, my hand gripping at the edge of the door frame. I did not want to listen, but the words forced themselves into my head. Poland. It had finally happened. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the kitchen. My older brothers, Hans and Karl, were sitting at the small wooden table, cups of coffee steaming in front of them. The faces were set in grim expressions. Hans, the eldest, had his brow frowned, staring down at the newspaper spread out between them, while Karl leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Did you hear?" Karl asked, glancing up as I entered the room. His voice was flat, but I could hear the tension underneath. I heard. I slid into my usual chair at the table, my eyes flicking to the radio on the counter. The announcer's voice still filled the room, cold and mechanical, reading out the details of the invasion. Hans reached out and turned the volume down, but the atmosphere was already thick with the weight of what we all knew. Things were changing and not for the better. "Do you think it will come here?" I asked quietly, though I already knew the answer. Hans didn't look up from the paper, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edges. "It's already here," he muttered. "It's been here for a while." Karl let out a breath, his gaze fixed on the window. Outside, the sky was pale and cloudless, as if mocking the gloom that had settled over our little kitchen. Karl glanced up at me. "Hilda, Mom said go and help her in the shop." I nodded silently. After breakfast, I went back to my room, pulling the curtains wide. A thin streak of sunlight slanted across the floor, touching the corner of my worn wardrobe. I opened it and stood for a moment, staring at the familiar rows of plain dresses, carefully folded skirts, and a few aprons hanging on the door. I pulled out a simple cotton dress, the color of faded lavender, and slipped it over my head. The fabric rough against my skin. As I tied my apron around my waist, I caught a glimpse of myself in the cracked mirror on the wardrobe door. My hair a tangle of dark waves, eyes still a little puffy from sleep, lips pressed into a thin line. I smoothed hair into a neat braid, the repetitive motion claiming my nerves. As I finished, I grabbed my shawl from the hook by the door. It was still a bit chilly outside in the early morning, this September air carrying the first signs of autumn. The street was quiet as I stepped out, save for the faint rumble of a distant truck and the occasional murmur of neighbors just waking. I could smell the dampness in the cobblestones from the morning dew, and the cool air made my cheeks tingle. The houses along our street were modest, with little gardens out front, each one marked by the same simple charm. People were starting the day, stepping out with baskets or standing by their gates, speaking in hushed tones about what the radio had just announced. Even the beds seemed quieter than usual, as if they too had heard the news. I kept my head down as I walked, not wanting to engage in conversation with anyone. I could already see my mother's shop at the end of the street. It was small, with a faded sign that read Schmidt's General Store. The paint was peeling at the edges, and the windows were lined with jars of flour, sugar, and small bags of beans. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the family afloat, and for that we were grateful. I reached the door and paused, listening to the faint clink of bottles inside and my mother's voice, muffled through the glass. She was always early to open, making sure everything was in order before morning customers arrived. I pushed open the door, the small bell above it chiming softly as I stepped inside. The familiar scent of the shop greeted me, an odd mix of spices, fresh bread, and soap. My mother was behind the counter, her back to me as she arranged a display of canned goods. "Hey," she said without turning, "go ahead and start stocking the shelves in the back. The delivery came in early this morning." "Okay," I replied, my voice steady. But as I walked past the rows of shelves filled with jars of pickles, tins of sardines, and rolls of fabric, the weight of the world pressed heavily on my chest. Life in the shop might continue as normal for now, but with every step I felt the war creeping closer, seeping into the cracks of our little routine. The morning rush was in full swing at the store, and I found myself surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of my mother's world. Customers chatted softly, the soft clicks of coins punctuating their conversations as they picked up their goods. I moved about the shop, arranging shelves and restocking drawers, but my mind drifted to the words echoing in my head: bombs, invasion, attack. As I reached for a can of soap on the top shelf, I caught a glimpse of the radio behind the counter, its antennae stretched like a spider's leg. It had been my constant companion these days, broadcasting updates that felt like an ominous thermal to the approaching storm. I could still hear the announcer's voice in my mind, the way it trembled over the airwaves, speaking of military movements and impending dangers. Each time I heard the word bomb, a chill crept down my spine. I imagined them falling from the sky, fierce and relentless, like the stories I heard from older boys in the neighborhood who had returned from summer camps. They had spoken of mock air raids, but their laughter had turned hollow when they talked about what would happen if the real thing came. I pictured it, flashes of light ripping through the sky, houses crumbling, streets transformed into ruins. "Make sure you double-check the order from the bakery. They were supposed to send us more bread today." My mother's voice broke through my thoughts, pulling me back to the present. I looked up to see her busy tying a knot in the strings of a sack of flour. As I organized the shelves, a flicker of movement caught my eye in the corner of the shop. A girl, perhaps a year or two older than me, slipped between the aisles, her movements quick and furtive. She glanced around, checking for witnesses. I paused, watching as she reached for a small tin of fruit, her fingers wrapping around it like a thief in the night. Before I could process what was happening, she shoved the tin into her coat pocket and darted toward the exit. My heart raced as I took a step forward. Had she really thought no one would notice? "Hey!" I shouted, surprising myself with the force of my voice. The bell above the door jingled as she bolted outside. Without thinking, I rushed after her, bursting into the cold air. I spotted her a few paces ahead, waving through the empty street, her coat flapping as she ran. The town was unusually quiet, and I could hear the distant rumble of a truck somewhere nearby. "Hey," I called, adrenaline coursing through my veins. She glanced back, but didn't slow down. I picked up my pace, feeling the ground beneath my feet. When I caught up to her, I lunged forward, grabbing her arm and yanking her to stop. She stumbled, eyes wide with surprise and anger. "Let go of me," she snarled, struggling against my grip, but I held on tight. "Why did you steal that?" I demanded, frustration boiling inside me. "You could have just asked." "Mind your own business," she spat, wrenching her arm free. I didn't let go, and in an instant we were locked in a fierce struggle. She pushed against me, and I shoved back, our bodies colliding as we wrestled for control. "What are you, a dog?" I yelled, but my words only fueled her anger. She shoved me hard, and I staggered back, feeling the sharp edge of a cobblestone bite into my foot. "Why don't you just leave me alone?" she shouted, launching herself at me again. This time I braced myself and met her charge. We collided, grappling and clutching at each other, the struggle igniting a fire within me. I felt the adrenaline pumping, and my heart raced as I pushed back, determined to hold my ground. She was fierce, her fist swinging wildly as she caught me across the cheek. I retaliated, shoving her against the side of a nearby building. "Watch me," she spat, her eyes flashing with defiance. With a sudden surge of energy, she kicked out, catching me in the stomach. I doubled over, gasping for breath. In the chaos of our struggle, the girl suddenly broke free from my grasp, slipping through the fingers like water. I lunged after her, but she was quick, darting down in the narrow street and disappearing around the corner. I stood there for a moment, panting and fuming, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. With a heavy heart, I turned back toward the shop. The cool air felt harsh against my skin, and as I approached, I could feel the stench of blood tickling from my nose. I wiped at my face, leaving a smear of red on my sleeve. As I stepped inside, the familiar warmth of the shop enveloped me, but the moment I crossed the threshold, my mother's voice rang out. "Oh gosh, Hilda, what happened to you?" she exclaimed, her eyes widening as she shook my bloodied nose and scraped hands. I opened my mouth to explain, but before I could say anything, she continued, "Where are the fruits? Did you bring them in?" I blinked, the shock of her words hitting me like a cold wave. "I was in a fight," I said. "Some girls stole a tin of fruit and—" "Fruits are not going to sell themselves, dear," she interrupted, her voice rising slightly with urgency. "You need to help me restock before the next customer arrives." "But Mom," I protested weakly. "Now, Hilda," she snapped, her tone broking no arguments. With a resigned sigh, I turned to face the shelves, my anger bubbling beneath at the surface. The fight, the girl's defiance, and the throbbing pain in my nose all faded into background as I grabbed the empty crates and began to fill them with remaining stock. We stayed in the shop until evening, just like we did every day. My hands moved on autopilot, restocking shelves and ringing up customers. Suddenly I heard the familiar jingle of the bell above the door. I lifted my head, seeing the sight of my father stepping inside. He wore his military uniform, the crisp fabric highlighting the broadness of his shoulders, his cap slightly tilted as if he'd just come from a long day. "Hi, Dad," I greeted, forcing a smile despite the dull ache in my nose. "Hey," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with an underlying tension. He scanned the shop before his gaze landed on me. "Where's your mother?" I pointed toward the other side of the street where I could see my mother engaged in conversation with Miss Franklin, her arms animated as she gestured. "She's talking with Miss Franklin." He nodded, his expression shifting slightly as if the weight settled on his shoulder. Your school starts tomorrow, huh? I nodded again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins, the glint of metal catching the fading light. Here, he said, counting out a small pile. Go get what you need for school. Thank you, I said. You can leave now, he added, glancing again at my mother. Tell her to go back to work. I nodded and slipped out of the shop, the cool evening air brushing against my cheeks. I approached my mother, who was still deep in conversation. Mom, I called, raising my voice slightly to break through the chatter. Dad says you need to get back to the shop. After informing my mother to return to the shop, I set off down the cobblestone street, feeling the cool evening air wrap around me. The shops were beginning to close, their signs swinging gently in the breeze, but I had just enough time to pick up some supplies. As I walked, the sounds of town shifted to a soft murmur. The distant laughter of children playing echoed off the buildings, but it felt like a world away from the concerns swirling in my mind. I passed the bakery, its warm scent of fresh bread still lingering in the air, and the butcher, where a few locals exchanged news in low voices. I made my way to the small stationery shop nestled between a tavern and a tailor's. Mr. Schwartz, my dad's friend. Its sign crackled gently as I opened the door, the bell above jingling to announce my arrival. Inside, the shop was dimly lit, with shelves lined with nearly stacked notebooks, pens, and other supplies. I walked down the aisles, my fingers brushing against the cool covers of notebooks. Mr. Schwartz, perched on the end of his nose, looked up from behind the counter. He offered a faint smile, his eyes crinking with warmth despite the somber atmosphere outside. Good evening, Hilda, he greeted. What brings you here today? Just picking up some things for school, I replied, trying to sound casual, though the weight of my earlier encounter still hung in my mind. Oh, preparing for the new term, I see, he said, nodding. Let me know if you need any help. I moved further into the shop, scanning the shelves for what I needed. I spotted a stack of blank notebooks, their pages crisp and inviting, and a display of pens in a rainbow color. Grabbing a couple of notebooks and a few pens, I felt a flicker of excitement despite the backdrop of the war that lingered in my thoughts. After gathering my supplies, I approached the counter, placing my items down. The shopkeeper rang them up, his finger moving deftly as he tailed the total. I fished out the coins my father had given me. Here you go, I said, handing over the money. He took the coins and smiled, placing my purchase in a small brown paper bag. Good luck with your studies, Hilda. Remember, knowledge is the best weapon we have against these troubling times. Thank you, I replied, touched by his words. With my bag in hand, I stepped back outside, the evening air fresh against my flushed cheeks. The sun was beginning to deep blue the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I took a deep breath, feeling a moment of calm amidst the chaos that surrounded us.